Spitfire was one of the most beautiful aircraft ever made, from Wright's Flyer to the F-22.
It began with a young genius's vision of a remarkable fighter and made history at the hands of a valiant few.
The Germans hated them when they saw Spitfire coming towards them. They used to call out Achtung Spitfire.
Germans are dive bombing a convoy out into sea. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 German dive bombers, Junkers 87s. There's one going down on his target now. Bomb. No, missed the ship. He hasn't hit a single ship. There are about 10 ships in the convoy.
July 17, 1940. BBC radio reporter Charles Gardner gives ringside commentary to an early air attack in the Battle of Britain from his perch atop the cliffs of Dover.
And here they come in absolute steep dive. You can see their bombs actually leave the fatigue. I'm looking round now. I can hear machine gun fire, but I can't see our Spitfires. There must be somewhere there. Oh, here's one coming down now. There's one coming down in flames. Somebody's hit a German, and he's coming down. There's a long streak. He's going down completely out of control, a long streak of smoke. He's the man's bailed out by parachute. He's a Junkers 87, and he's going slap into the sea, and there he goes. Smash!
There is no doubt the whole of Britain shares Gardner's unbridled enthusiasm for the legendary Spitfire fighter planes charging in to save the convoy from destruction.
I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Germans herring back towards France now for all they can go, and here there are Spitfires coming after them. There's going to be a big fight, I think, out there, but it will be too far away. But it was a very unsuccessful attack on the convoy, I must say.
You couldn't help seeing them. I mean, they were the most beautiful airplane, and I think it ever was.
Known for its small, clean fuselage and slim, curved wings, the Spitfire was the star of the first generation of one-winged metal fighters. Billed as the world's fastest fighter when it debuted in 1936, this aircraft was as graceful as it was quick.
The early ones, with a sort of 1,000 horsepower Merlin, were like a ballerina. I'm sure a lot of people will tell you that it was just great. You could put it in any attitude, any part of the sky you wanted, and you knew it would never frighten you.
It did frighten the Germans, with formidable wing armament, tight turns, and a top speed of 380 miles per hour. It was obvious, said one Frenchman who flew it, that the Spitfire was conceived by cool, precise brains and conscientious hands.
From a pilot's point of view, it had no faults. It was actual perfection to fly, beautiful fly.
Well, we knew that they were, you know, good little planes, and that they were doing their stuff, and they were British.
Nearly 15 years active with Britain's Royal Air Force, the Spitfire would undergo many changes, fly faster and fight harder. It became a symbol of a country's iron will for survival in the darkest days of war, the Battle of Britain. 6 weeks of brutal air combat over England in the summer and fall of 1940 that changed the course of World War II. Just prior to that fateful battle, spring 1940, the armies of German dictator Adolf Hitler blast through Europe and trounce the last stronghold of Allied troops in France. "360,000 British soldiers drop their arms and retreat. Rescuers at the French port of Dunkirk spend 9 days dragging exhausted, oil-smeared forces from Channel waters and shipping them to safety.
The British had literally nothing left after Dunkirk except the rifles the soldiers carried. They left all their artillery, they had the tanks, any heavy equipment they had at all. It was a bit like the South after the siege of Petersburg. I mean, the army was a bit like the army that marched to Appomattox. I mean, the British had nothing.
A few key aides urge Hitler to forge ahead with his lightning war. Victory in Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands and France had come so quickly. Bring Britain to her knees while she still reels from Dunkirk's disaster. But Hitler has another plan for Britain. He holds out for peace, confident Britain will realize she is beaten. He even plans a victory parade in Paris.
Dass Hitler in Wirklichkeit gar keine Invasion von England gewollt hat.
Hitler didn't want to invade England. In truth, he was an Anglophile, even though he often made insulting comments about Winston Churchill. He didn't want to ruin things with England, since he regarded it as a nation that was related to us, our British cousins.
Newly appointed Prime Minister Winston Churchill does not give in, and in fact threatens to drown German troops in the sea before they ever set foot on British shores. On July 2nd, 1940, a furious Hitler orders his army, navy and air force to prepare for invasion. The German army is to be carried across the English Channel by 15,000 river barges in a full-scale assault over 225 miles of coastline. The hastily assembled scheme, called Operation Sea Lion, has little support within the German military.
General Halder, who was the Chief of Staff, said that the operation would resemble a large-scale river crossing, which shows really how land-minded the Germans were. The English Channel at its narrowest point is 19 miles wide, and it's a very stormy and treacherous passage of sea.
Hitler's first step is to send out his elite air force, the Luftwaffe, to clear the skies of British planes.
They had a general aim, which was to destroy the Royal Air Force, particularly the Royal Air Force fighters, because they thought if they destroyed the fighters, then they could attack the Royal Navy, and if they attacked the Royal Navy and defeated it, then they could invade Britain.
In Britain, the resolute head of Fighter Command, Hugh Dowding, prepares for Germany's impending attack with a controversial decision to keep his Spitfires on British soil. After Dunkirk, the French fight on against the German army and plead for more British fighters to protect their dwindling forces. But Air Marshal Dowding lost 300 pilots in the battle for France. He has none to throw away on what he feels is a lost cause.
The politicians wanted us to send Spitfires to help the French, and because most of the squadrons, British squadrons in France, were Hurricanes. But Dowding very sensibly said, look, I have to have these Spitfires here. No good wasting them there, and I want to use them for the eventual defense of Great Britain. And he was right. Didn't make him any more popular with some of the politicians.
Britain and its Royal Air Force now stand alone to fight against Hitler's tyrannical quest to dominate Europe. As Prime Minister Churchill warns the people of Britain that darker days lie ahead for their isolated island nation.
What General Weygand has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. We shall defend our island. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Late spring 1940, British citizens take the words of Prime Minister Winston Churchill to heart as they prepare for an imminent German attack. London school children have been packed off to safety in remote villages. Factories furiously work overtime, producing badly needed fighters, Spitfires and Hurricanes. A ragtag corps of volunteers known as the Home Guard makes use of any available weapon, including pitchforks and golf clubs, as they patrol Britain's roads and coastline. It's the job of the Observer Corps to scout for enemy planes.
A lot of policemen used to do it in their off-duty hours, which was very good because you sort of had to set up your own post. So if you wanted, right in the middle of nowhere, and you wanted to set up an Observer Corps post, you would be issued with the basic kit, like a telephone and a machine for looking and spotting aircraft and a pair of binoculars.
The defense of the nation lies largely in the hands of the fighter pilots of Britain's Royal Air Force. They are a surprisingly international cast of 1,200 young airmen, British, American, Canadian. Some of the fiercest of these air warriors are from Eastern Europe, Poles, Czechs, others determined to turn the tide on the madman who has already ravaged their homeland.
Our squadron has brought down 33 German planes in a month. We hope we shall bring down many more. Nazdar.
Many of the British airmen are well-to-do auxiliary pilots with longish hair and a cool distaste for military formality. The fighter glamour boys.
The British pilots treated the whole thing a bit like sport. They thought it was a bit like a game of rugby.
And when I met John, I thought another damn fighter pilot, nothing in his head. That's what I felt about them to start with, that they thought, you know, that they were the
cat's whiskers.
The cat's whiskers, yes. And then I discovered there was a lot in his head, and we got on fine.
However confident these young pilots may be, they are under-equipped and badly outnumbered by their highly trained rivals. The Germans, with 2,000 planes, have twice the air power. In early summer, the British hear the ominous din of German aircraft flying toward them across the English Channel. Britain's battle plan? Against the wishes of most RAF officials, Air Marshal Hugh Dowding sends up small numbers of Spitfires and Hurricanes, 12 to 16 at a time, to attack German airplanes. He is determined to preserve precious manpower for what could be a drawn-out battle. This defies conventional wisdom, which is to send out every available plane against every incoming attack.
His strategy for the Battle of Britain, I think, was a very orthodox one, which was to keep a large number of fighters at a high degree of readiness and to direct them against the German bomber formations in a very carefully controlled way through the radar early warning system.
Radar, Britain's secret weapon. Dowding has the ability to analyze ultra-high frequency waves reflected from the surface of German planes. The Germans know it exists, but not its true capacity. Dozens of fighter stations are manned by the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Plotters like Vera Shaw and Philippa Robertson take in data from Observer Corps and cathode ray tube operators. They then plot incoming German planes on large operations boards. Numbers of planes, height, and direction.
They were all on the little boards, yes. They were all on the plots that we received, either from a teleprinter or from the, what do you call it, the earphone things? Through the earphones, from the Observer Corps.
It was all done on a map-type method. They were in different trigonometric points, and they reported back information about the particular square that they operated in. They were very good at aircraft recognition, and they simply passed the information of how many aircraft, what height they were flying at, what type of aircraft they were, and in what direction they were traveling.
Pilots and planes are dear. Radar frees them from aerial patrol duty. July is a month of limited but bitter air battles. German planes attack ships in the English Channel, smash the ports, and batter the RAF in dogfights. Despite radar's early warning, Dowding loses 145 aircraft in 4 weeks. In August, the expanding battle finally moves inland.
The arrows were showing the actual plane's movement, and the blocks were giving you the name of that particular raid. And it's, as Philippa said, its height and its direction, and it's then the number of planes in that particular raid, when they knew.
The information on the incoming raid is sent out to fighter bases where pilots have been on alert since dawn.
Normally, we were sitting around in chairs or lying on beds at what you call dispersal. And the phone would ring, and as it rang, you all sat up tense.
And then, of course, the classic sign would happen. The bell would ring on the telephone, and then somebody would ring an enormous handbell, and the pilots would jump up out of their deck chairs as they were sitting around outside the crew rooms and sprint to their aeroplanes. Scramble would take place.
And off you go, jump into your aeroplanes and take off in formation.
But once you were airborne, you're more relaxed then. You knew what it was all about. You knew you were going somewhere and going to do something. The control would come on the radio with the squadron's call sign and say, they used to use the expression angels, angels 1-5, and so you would start climbing up on that vector to angels 1-5.
With the hunting cry of tally-ho, British fighters are off to engage their rivals. Spitfire pilot David Glazer's commanding officer has a startling strategy for attacking German bombers.
He'd bring us in right over the top of the bombers, and then he'd roll straight down and go through the middle of them. They'd immediately do that as he shot down through them, and we were waiting, and that's when we came in, to pick them off, because he broke up the formation, which was a very good and a bit of a hairy thing to watch, but it was a very good tactic.
The Spitfire is fairly evenly matched with its main rival in the Battle of Britain, the ME-109.
You couldn't see out of the cockpit of the 109 very well, whereas the Spitfire had actually quite good visibility from its cockpit. And there were other things, like the 109 could turn a little bit better, but the Spitfire could go faster.
The ME-109 has cannons. Their shells explode on impact. The Spitfire does not have the long-nosed cannon, but there is a lot to work with, as bullets blast from 8 Browning 303 machine guns.
Schossen, und da kam also diese Gießkanne, die 8 Maschinen.
The 8 machine guns that the Spitfires and the Hurricanes had were extremely effective. There were so many bullets that when they fired their guns, it looked like a watering can pouring water out of their machine. They were sure to hit something.
I suppose it would have been nice if at that stage we had 20mm cannon. On the other hand, you see great bits of aircraft flying off and that kind of thing. In fact, you had to dodge them on occasion.
German raids are now on with a vengeance. August 13, 1940 is Eagle Day, the official start date for inland raids. On August 15th, the Luftwaffe flies nearly 1,800 sorties.
Total chaos, not as quiet as it's usually depicted when you see it in films. because there were people, plotters, calling for new raids. There were these runners behind here running around to get the new raids, bringing them back. And then people were calling out to a board at the back there that there was a board up there that said it was if it was an unidentified raid.
The target, RAF airfields. Hangars set afire and runways pounded with bombs. The entire sky above 200 miles of British coastline is black with planes. On this day, the Royal Air Force claims it's downed 90 German aircraft. Not a bad figure, but the effort brings Dowding's fighter command to the brink of exhaustion. Far too many of Britain's pilots have been killed or wounded early in this battle. On August 15th alone, more than 100 RAF airmen are lost. That's nearly a fifth of Dowding's entire force. Surviving RAF pilots, including 21-year-old Cyril Bamberger, have lost friends in devastating combat and fear for their own lives in this battle against the Goliath that is the Luftwaffe.
Of course, we acted out as if it was a wonderful thing, but it was only a performance by the majority of pilots. I was very frightened. Very, very scared.
In 1935, Adolf Hitler announced the re-emergence of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. With the threat of a major air conflict looming over Europe, British aircraft designer R.J. Mitchell created a single-seat monoplane to be the star of Britain's fighter fleet. Mitchell was the boy genius who at the tender age of 25 became chief designer at Supermarine Aviation Works. His agile seaplanes dominated international flying contests and were the prototype for the Spitfire.
It was a beautiful, long, thin thing with a very neat fuselage, I suppose you'd say. And of course it had these wonderful wings, which were curved at the ends. It was all said that R.J. Mitchell designed it from watching seagulls.
Mitchell preserved exceptionally clean cowling lines by locating the radiator under the starboard wing. Never before was such attention lavished on the sheer aesthetics of a frontline fighter.
The P-38 was just... nobody bothered with what it looked like. They just put a great big engine on a great big strong airframe, and it worked, and they said, right. Now, he said Mitchell, when he was designing the Spitfire, was always saying, well, perhaps it would look nicer if we just shaved a little bit off here. That angle doesn't look quite right.
One of the things for which the Spitfire is particularly famous is this elliptical-shaped wing, which is more or less unique. He decided that he needed the thing to be wide in the middle of the wing so that they could fit big guns into it. And it turned out, when they built it that way, that it actually improved the handling of the aircraft enormously, because the wide chord, as they say, in the middle of the wing here, meant that you could take it down to very low speeds, but still get very good roll qualities in the aircraft. And it was a very sweet handling aircraft. All the pilots who've ever flown the Spitfire have always said how wonderful it was to handle.
The young design genius had his own personal menace with which to contend.
He already knew that he had cancer, so he basically designed this aircraft under a sentence of death.
Reginald Joseph Mitchell was only 42 when he died of cancer in 1937. 3 years later, the Spitfire was flying out to defend Mitchell's beloved English countryside in the Battle of Britain. The daily tallies of Luftwaffe attacks in the first weeks of the Battle of Britain prove that Germany has the upper hand, but only just. German Reich Marshal Hermann Goering predicted resounding defeat over Britain's Royal Air Force in just 4 weeks. But 4 weeks into battle, it is clear the RAF is still in the fight.
The Luftwaffe had been told by Goering and everybody else that we would be pretty well annihilated within the first couple of weeks. They realized something was going on when they kept coming over here and finding Spitfires and Hurricanes waiting for them each time they arrived.
Germans suspect those spindly steel towers along the coast are the reason British fighters are always airborne and ready for them. Some of the first inland raids Goering launches with his Stuka dive bombers are on key radar towers on the Kent and Sussex coast. It's a task one historian compares to dropping peas on pinheads.
Griffe mit Stukas,
It is impossible to destroy such a tall, narrow target with bombs. You might get a few hits, but the damage is easy to repair. So the bombing didn't achieve much.
Wie ein Mast.
The combination of the target, the actual towers being very difficult to hit, and the aircraft being ineffective against modern Spitfires made the raids on the radar towers not very cost effective as far as they were concerned.
Stukas are so slow and ineffective, Goering yanks them out of service on August 18th and puts an end to strikes on radar stations. Bombing raids on airfields continued, but also failed to bring about the scorching damage for which the Germans had hoped.
Well, they were very primitive airfields on the whole. I mean, a lot of the fighters flew off grass. If you bombed one, literally field, grass-covered field, you could more or less go and land in another one. Also, of course, the Air Force was defending itself at the same time, and so it was very costly for the Germans to come and attack the airfields.
Other tactical difficulties? Orders from High Command rob Me-109 pilots of their power to take the offensive. They are directed to fly with the bombers they escort, not break away to chase enemy fighters. The worst problem for frustrated Me-109 airmen, supreme in European skies, is lack of range. They only have enough fuel to fly for 90 minutes total. Barely time to make a raid on Britain. Many German pilots ditch in the English Channel, even after successful missions. A jumble of events conspires against the Germans, allowing Britain's fighter force to hold on, even through repeated devastating attacks. The legacy of the Spitfire is born as this modern, expensive, all-metal fighter grabs an inordinate amount of attention for fending off the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. This, despite being outnumbered and in many ways outperformed by its truly able sidekick, the Hurricane.
The Hurricane, although every bit as effective as the Spitfire, was very much a traditional aeroplane. And if you like, it was the workhorse. And it was built on traditional methods, covered in fabric, and looked very much like aeroplanes of a slightly earlier era.
The Spitfire has certainly had a very good press, and some people would say that it's had rather too good a press, because in the Battle of Britain, there were far more Hurricanes than Spitfires, and they achieved something like 5/7 of the total kills in the Battle of Britain.
Even German commanders are impressed with the Spitfire. In late August, Reich Marshal Goering berates the Luftwaffe for failing to achieve air supremacy. He then turns to dapper German Air Commander Adolf Galland and asks what he needs to win this battle. Galland's impertinent answer, "I need a squadron of Spitfires." August 24, 1940. The most devastating phase of the Battle of Britain inadvertently begins.
Zuerst hat ein deutscher Verband
A German formation mistakenly dropped bombs on London's residential areas. They did not intend to fly to London. Their target was really an industrial city north of London. The crew completely lost their orientation and wandered off their course. Those were the first bombs, German bombs, that dropped onto an English residential area. And it was an accident.
The very next evening, Winston Churchill orders British bombers to attack Berlin. A battle of retaliatory bombings on city centers is underway. The Blitz. This is no longer a war between soldiers. It is a war on citizens. Goering sees this unexpected change of focus away from airfields as his chance to deal Britain's fighters a final deadly blow. London is certainly a target. The last of the RAF fighters will fly to defend. September 7th, 1940. The first of a series of Hitler's mass raids on London. 625 German bombers, escorted by as many fighters, deliver the heaviest air attack waged on a British city to this point.
It was very frightening, really, because my mother was in London, and we had friends, of course, all over London. Our church was bombed, wasn't it? And it was very worrying, especially the doc's father, I remember very well.
We actually have a photograph of a Heinkel 111 flying where this building is. So 55 years ago, at about noon, if we looked straight upwards, we would have seen a Heinkel 111 overhead about to drop its bombs and set these docks on fire, because they did, of course, create really a firestorm. They burnt out the London docks. But there was about 5 or 6 miles of continuously burning dockland, one of the biggest fires that has ever taken place in Europe.
The RAF is indeed dealt a harsh blow. The change in target confuses plotters. British fighters are too low to attack the incoming raid. On this day, 42 aircraft and 14 pilots are lost. The RAF is so desperate for pilots, officials have slashed training time from 6 months to 2 weeks.
When I got to the squadron it was sometime about mid-August, there were, I should say, certainly 50% of those pilots had been lost.
Hitler's private hope is that citizens will turn on Winston Churchill, blame him for bringing such destruction upon the nation. But for the proud British, the pragmatic phrase is business as usual. By night, they sleep in subways, protected from the bombings. By day, yet confident of victory, they clean up the rubble and systematically piece their shattered lives back together.
We always felt, you know, nobody had invaded England yet and it wasn't going to happen now. I don't think anybody thought that. Did they?
No, I don't think they did.
I was certain as a little boy, growing up in the war, I mean, of course the British were going to win. It was absolutely ridiculous to think that. I actually used to feel rather sorry for Hitler, and I used to say, why doesn't he understand? I mean, he's obviously going to lose the war. Why doesn't he just give up? We were a proud imperial people. We weren't going to give in. We looked down on the Germans. We'd beaten them in the First World War.
A few days of bombing, and 2,000 Londoners are dead, 14,000 wounded, 50,000 homeless. But with the Luftwaffe focus on London, not the airfields, Fighter Command has a scarce opportunity to repair its planes. Then, September 15, the Luftwaffe sets out to make a final, full-fledged assault on the battered British capital, which Goering swears will wipe out British fighters and make Prime Minister Churchill scream for mercy.
It was very quiet at first because it didn't crop up until about 9 o'clock. And I think I was writing letters. And suddenly from command I heard, "Be prepared, big raid coming up." I dropped my book, and I don't think I picked it up for about 2 hours. It was at my feet. And it was such a big raid that the sergeant in charge of the watch told me to query it. He didn't believe it. And of course you weren't meant to query things because they didn't like the disturbance at command. But in the end he was so insistent that I had to query it. And I asked them, I said, "Is it really 250 plus?" And they said, "Yes, but don't disturb us." And so he then believed it.
With operators plotting the German formations for over 30 minutes, the Spitfires and Hurricanes have time to fly high, giving them the advantage of swooping down on German planes.
So then it started from this area, of course, the usual southeast, and it went on like that all day, waves and waves and waves of them coming over.
3 waves of bombers and fighters are on their way to finish off London. German crews are shocked to see Spitfires knife through formations with guns hammering. Their extremely poor intelligence had told them the RAF barely exists. Dowding's strategy of holding back fighters is about to pay off. Yes, the RAF is terribly stretched, but not as badly as the Germans think.
Mr. Churchill came down as he was then, and Mrs. Churchill came down on that particular day. And we had all our squadrons up, all in combat. And we had borrowed from 10 groups, 11 group here, we'd borrowed from 10 group and, what was the other one?
Was it 12?
12 and 10. And so he borrowed those and they were all up as well. And Mr. Churchill turned to the controller that was sitting in the middle there, and he said, "Have we any more?" And the controller said, "No. We've got them all in combat."
It is touted as the greatest day in the Battle of Britain. The claims? 183 German planes knocked out of the sky by British Spitfires and Hurricanes.
Any claims, Johnny? 109 destroyed, buddy, yes. Oh, good show.
Actual kills are a third of those claimed, but this psychological victory for the British dashes the morale of German pilots, who feel they are being misled by their commanders.
And I think the British even created an artificial turning point by saying that September the 15th was the sort of great day of the Battle of Britain. It was the day when they'd shot down 180 German aircraft, which they hadn't, but it didn't matter because they believed they had. And they thought that they'd turned a corner, and that therefore, thereafter, they were going to win the battle.
Dowding, still cautious and quite worried of what is yet to come, supports his pilots' claims of their greatest day.
We did hear of where he was asked whether our claims were exaggerated for the enemy aircraft shot down. And he replied he didn't worry about that at all, but the outcome would be proved with whether the enemy continued attacking. So I thought that was a wonderful support for his pilots in the circumstances.
There was a very common sense in Britain in in August and September 1940 that something tremendous and critical was going on. Every day they radio broadcast the numbers of German aircraft shot down. I think there was a very strong sensation of the country living on a thread.
Remember that when you're taking part in a thing like that, you haven't got the benefit of hindsight. So that I must say, we never, at that time, we never particularly thought that the battle was ever going to end.
After Germany's September 15th defeat, the air battles continue. But with each attack, Britain's tenacious fighter force flies up to fight, and the impending autumn weather threatens to make the English Channel unnavigable for invasion barges. Hitler considers these facts, and on September 17, 1940, while continuing his air campaign, he postpones his invasion of Britain.
I suppose Goering realized that he wasn't getting anywhere, and the morale of the German bomber squadrons was going down. But suddenly we noticed all the invasion barges were being decommissioned and so on.
There is no final clash, no declaration of victory. The Battle of Britain in the autumn of 1940, in the words of one German pilot, just fell asleep.
Several of, certainly my squadrons, fiercest battles, very often fighter versus fighter, took place after the Battle of Britain was officially over, but nobody actually rang a bell to tell us when it was over.
I mean, the Battle of Britain, as we know, lasted about 6 weeks, and they were at full stretch for 6 weeks. But I think had it gone on for 3 months, had the Germans been able to keep up the pressure, then the strain on the quite small numbers in fighter command might have proved unbearable. After all, they were the few, the famous few, what Churchill called the few.
Hitler is now plotting to invade Russia. He will deal with Britain later. The trouble is, later never comes.
In a way, the Battle of Britain didn't just save Britain from invasion. It also created the conditions where Churchill could open up a second front in the Mediterranean, humiliate the Italians, cause Hitler to go to the Italians' rescue for prestige purposes, get involved in a war in North Africa, and find that the sort of nice, simple plan he had spawned complications which eventually were very, very damaging.
The Spitfire was there every step of the way. It was manufactured until 1948 and wasn't taken out of RAF frontline service until 1951. In all, 20,000 Spits were built. Over the years, they gained 2,000 pounds in weight and increased speed by nearly 100 miles per hour. The Spitfire was eventually outfitted with cannons as well as machine guns. Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself was impressed on a visit to Biggin Hill Fighter Station, where John Bisbee served as armament officer.
And he said, "Young man, show me your cannon guns." So I took him to where there was an aircraft pointing at the butts and helped him into the cockpit, and he looked up at me and said rather sheepishly, "Do you think I could have a go?" So I said, "I thought so, sir," and I turned the button on the control column of the aircraft round to fire, and he pressed the button, and immediately, of course, all hell was let loose with these cannons going off and the machine guns. And I realized that the cannon shells were going right through these butts and coming out the other side. So I hastily told him that I thought that would do, sir. anyhow, he had his go with cannons, and he obviously enjoyed it. And then I took him back to his party.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.